I never believed in the stories, not really. Sure, every village has its share of weird legends, and growing up in Whispering Pines was no different. But when you spend long enough away from the place, the superstitions your parents used to mutter over bonfires feel like nothing more than old ghost stories meant to scare kids into behaving. That's what I thought anyway, until the night I came back, and Whispering Waters reminded me why some warnings should never be ignored. The lake had always been the heart of our little village, beautiful in its stillness but cloaked in an unnatural quiet. Even as a kid, I felt there was something off about it. The air around it was heavier, and the water, no matter the time of day, always looked like liquid shadow. And then, of course, there was the rule: never look into the lake at midnight, or something will look back at you. It was a thing the adults said to keep us from wandering off at night. I used to joke about it with my best friend, Sarah, daring her to sneak out with me to test it. She never took the bait. I wish I'd followed her example. On my first night back, Sarah and I met up at the Rusty Lantern, the town's only bar, to catch up. She hadn't changed much, same nervous laugh, same way of fiddling with the straw in her drink. But there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of unease that hadn't been there before. She leaned in close after her second cider, her voice dropping to a whisper. Have you noticed anything weird about the lake? Weird how I asked, half expecting her to laugh it off like old times. Sarah didn't laugh. She glanced over her shoulder, as if she was afraid someone might be listening. Things in the water, she murmured. Reflections that don't move like they should. Shapes under the surface. Even when the lake's still, she hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. It's like it's alive or something. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced out a laugh. Come on, Sarah. It's just a lake. Probably your imagination. She didn't smile. Yeah, she said quietly, looking away. Probably. I shrugged it off then, but later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling of my childhood room, her words stuck with me. Reflections that don't move like they should. And then, like a whisper from the past, my mother's voice echoed in my mind. Never look into the lake at midnight. I told myself it was just a story, just a stupid rule to scare kids. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, doesn't it? By the time the clock struck 11:45, I had already slipped on my shoes and was halfway out the door. I told myself it was just a story, just a stupid rule to scare kids. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at you, doesn't it? By the time the clock struck 11:45, I had already slipped on my shoes and was halfway out the door. The night was colder than I remembered, the kind of cold that bites at your fingertips and creeps down your spine. The moon hung low in the sky, swollen and pale, casting a milky glow over the lake as I made my way down the old dirt path. The woods surrounding Whispering Waters were unnervingly quiet, as though the whole world had stopped breathing. By the time I reached the water's edge, my pulse was hammering in my ears. The lake looked exactly as it always had, calm, endless, a sheet of black glass stretching out before me. The surface barely rippled, but somehow it didn't feel still. I stood there for a moment, my breath clouding in the cold air, feeling suddenly ridiculous. Sarah's stories, my mom's warnings. It was all in my head, and yet my feet didn't move. The thought hit me before I even realized I was thinking it. What if there's something to it? I glanced down at my watch. 11:58. 2 minutes to midnight. 2 minutes to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of old wives' tales. I knelt by the edge of the lake, the damp soil cold against my knees. My reflection stared back at me, rippling faintly in the water. It looked normal, my dark hair falling loose around my face. The heavy jacket I'd thrown on in a hurry, even the nervous, half smile I gave myself to break the tension. 1 minute to midnight. The silence pressed down harder, like an invisible weight on my chest. My own reflection seemed sharper now, clearer than it should have been, even in the dim light. The surface of the lake felt alive, like it was waiting. My watch beeped softly. Midnight. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake didn't boil or bubble. No shadowy hand reached out to drag me under. I almost laughed at how foolish I'd been to expect something dramatic. But then my reflection blinked. I didn't. The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp, and I scrambled backward, my hands sinking into the damp soil. My reflection, no, not my reflection, was still crouched by the water's edge, its eyes fixed on me. It tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like a predator sizing up its prey, and then it smiled. The smile wasn't mine. It stretched too wide, splitting its face into something grotesque and wrong, and I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing in the water raised a hand, my hand, but it wasn't a reflection anymore. The water rippled as the hand reached out, its fingers long and too thin, dripping with inky blackness. It was coming for me. A sharp snap from the woods broke the spell, and I stumbled to my feet, running blindly. Branches clawing at my face and clothes. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my house, slamming the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, trembling, my ears straining for any sound, any whisper of pursuit. But the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I thought I was safe. Until I saw the trail of wet footprints leading from the front door to the mirror in the hallway. The night was colder than I remembered, the kind of cold that bites at your fingertips and creeps down your spine. The moon hung low in the sky, swollen and pale, casting a milky glow over the lake as I made my way down the old dirt path. The woods surrounding Whispering Waters were unnervingly quiet, as though the whole world had stopped breathing. By the time I reached the water's edge, my pulse was hammering in my ears. The lake looked exactly as it always had, calm, endless, a sheet of black glass stretching out before me. The surface barely rippled, but somehow it didn't feel still. I stood there for a moment, my breath clouding in the cold air, feeling suddenly ridiculous. Sarah's stories, my mom's warnings. It was all in my head, and yet my feet didn't move. The thought hit me before I even realized I was thinking it. What if there's something to it? I glanced down at my watch. 11:58. 2 minutes to midnight. 2 minutes to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid of old wives' tales. I knelt by the edge of the lake, the damp soil cold against my knees. My reflection stared back at me, rippling faintly in the water. It looked normal, my dark hair falling loose around my face. The heavy jacket I'd thrown on in a hurry. Even the nervous, half smile I gave myself to break the tension. 1 minute to midnight. The silence pressed down harder, like an invisible weight on my chest. My own reflection seemed sharper now, clearer than it should have been, even in the dim light. The surface of the lake felt alive, like it was waiting. My watch beeped softly. Midnight. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake didn't boil or bubble. No shadowy hand reached out to drag me under. I almost laughed at how foolish I'd been to expect something dramatic, but then my reflection blinked. I didn't. The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp, and I scrambled backward, my hands sinking into the damp soil. My reflection, no, not my reflection, was still crouched by the water's edge, its eyes fixed on me. It tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like a predator sizing up its prey, and then it smiled. The smile wasn't mine. It stretched too wide, splitting its face into something grotesque and wrong, and I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing in the water raised a hand, my hand, but it wasn't a reflection anymore. The water rippled as the hand reached out, its fingers long and too thin, dripping with inky blackness. It was coming for me. A sharp snap from the woods broke the spell, and I stumbled to my feet, running blindly, branches clawing at my face and clothes. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my house, slamming the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, trembling, my ears straining for any sound, any whisper of pursuit. But the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I thought I was safe. Until I saw the trail of wet footprints leading from the front door to the mirror in the hallway. I froze, my eyes locked on the footprints. They were unmistakable, too large to be mine, the shape distorted, almost claw-like. Water pooled at the base of the hallway mirror. The glass fogged over as if something had exhaled against it. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, drawn by a twisted, morbid curiosity. Slowly, I turned to face the mirror. At first, all I saw was myself disheveled, pale, eyes wide and bloodshot with terror. But as I stared, something shifted. The reflection's lips twitched upward, curling into that same grotesque smile I had seen at the lake. And then it winked. I staggered back, my shoulder hitting the wall with a painful thud. The sound seemed to snap me out of whatever trance I'd been in, and I bolted to my room, slamming the door behind me. Locked it, shoved a chair under the knob for good measure, and collapsed onto the bed, every muscle in my body shaking. For hours I sat there, staring at the door, expecting it to rattle or burst open. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, oppressive and heavy, until exhaustion finally dragged me under. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, casting the room in warm, golden light. For a moment, I let myself believe it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, terrible dream, conjured by too many drinks and an overactive imagination. Then I noticed the marks on my arm. They were faint, almost invisible in the morning light, but they were there, dark, bruise-like, shapes forming a pattern that made my stomach turn. It looked like a spiral, jagged and uneven, with smaller lines branching off like cracks in ice. I rubbed at them, hoping they'd fade, but the skin felt wrong, tender, almost hot to the touch. Panic bubbled up in my chest as fragments of the previous night came rushing back the lake. The reflection, the footprints, the thing in the mirror. Grabbing my phone, I called Sarah. She picked up after the third ring, her voice groggy but laced with concern. "You okay?" she asked. "You sound off." I saw something, I stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Last night, at the lake, and now there's this mark on my arm. Sarah, I think it followed me home." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You looked, didn't you?" My throat went dry. "You knew." "I tried to warn you," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's not just a story, it's real. The lake. It doesn't just reflect what's there. It reflects what's waiting." "What the hell does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. "Meet me at my place. I'll explain everything I can, but you need to get out of your house. The longer you stay there, the stronger it'll get." Sarah's house was on the other side of town, and the drive there felt like an eternity. Every shadow that flickered in my peripheral vision made my stomach twist. Every reflective surface seemed to hum with unseen energy. I avoided looking directly at my rearview mirror, but out of the corner of my eye, I could swear I saw movement, something shifting just beyond my reflection. When I arrived, Sarah yanked the door open before I could even knock. She looked worse then. She had the night before, her skin pale, her eyes dark-rimmed and frantic. She pulled me inside, locking the door behind her. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, showing her the marks on my arm, her face drained of color. "It's marked you," she whispered. "That thing you saw in the lake. It's not just a reflection. It's a shadow, a piece of something from the other side. And now that it's seen you, it won't stop until it takes your place." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Takes my place? What are you talking about?" Sarah grabbed a book from her coffee table, its cover warped and water-damaged, and flipped to a page filled with strange symbols and faded text. "Whispering Waters isn't just a lake," she said. "It's a doorway. The reflections are alive, but they're trapped. They can only come through if someone looks too long, if someone lets them in. And once they're here, she trailed off, her hands trembling. They trade places, I finished for her, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She nodded. And if it's marked you, it's already started. The more you see it, the stronger it gets. You have to sever the connection before it's too late. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. How I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes filled with fear and guilt. You have to go back to the lake, and you have to destroy it, destroy the reflection. The thought of returning to the lake sent a jolt of dread through me. But what choice did I have? I glanced at my arm, the spiral marks seeming darker now, more pronounced. They throbbed. Faintly, as if the thing marking me knew we were talking about it. What if I don't? I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. You don't want to find out, Sarah replied. But let's just say, if it fully takes your place, no. One will even know you're gone. The weight of her words settled on me like lead. We spent the next hour going over what Sarah knew. It wasn't much, just scraps of stories, passed down by her grandmother and rumors from the older villagers. The lake, she explained, wasn't natural. It had always been there, even before the town was founded, and the legends about it dated back centuries. People who looked too long at their reflection at night were said to disappear, their loved ones swearing they acted strange in the days before they vanished. And this thing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's alive. Sarah nodded. It's alive. And it's patient. It won't rush because it doesn't need to. It'll wear you down, make you doubt yourself, break you piece by piece. That's how it gets in. Great, I muttered, raking a hand through my hair. And you're sure destroying it is the only way? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the water-damaged book. There's one other way, she admitted. But it's worse. Worse than having my soul yanked out by a lake demon, I snapped, my nerves fraying. Her eyes darted to the window, as if she was afraid something might be watching. If you offer it, someone else instead of yourself, it'll take them and leave you alone. The silence that followed was suffocating. No, I said finally, my voice firm despite the sick knot in my stomach. I'm not doing that. Sarah didn't argue. She just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part pity, part guilt. By the time I left her house, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. Shadows stretched long across the road as I drove back, the marks on my arm throbbing harder with each passing mile. I reached my house just as dusk settled in, the light fading fast. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the lake's presence was reaching out to me even from this distance. I stepped inside and immediately froze. The wet footprints were back. This time they led from the hallway mirror to the kitchen, the water pooling on the tiles in uneven shapes. My breath hitched as I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. In the kitchen, the air felt colder, and the smell of damp earth lingered. On the table, my reflection was waiting for me. Not in the glass, no, it was there, sitting at the table. Its features were mine but warped, its eyes sunken and black, its mouth stretched into that awful, too wide grin. It cocked its head at me, mocking, as if it could hear the scream building in my throat. What do you want from me? I choked out, my voice trembling. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, my hand, and pointed at my arm, where the spiral marks now burned as if searing into my skin. And then it whispered, in my voice but distorted, like a broken radio midnight. The lake. My knees buckled, and I staggered backward, clutching the wall to keep from falling. When I looked up again, it was gone. The chair where it had been sitting was soaked, water dripping onto the floor in slow, steady plinks. Every shadow felt alive, every reflective surface hummed with malevolence. The marks on my arm were darker than ever, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. By the time midnight drew near, I had no fight left in me. I grabbed a flashlight, a knife from the kitchen, and the shard of a broken mirror I'd found near the lake days before. If I was going to face this thing, I wasn't going unarmed. My hands trembled as I drove back to Whispering Waters. The road bathed in silver moonlight. The forest around the lake was eerily silent again, the trees seeming to lean closer together, as if they were trying to keep me out or trap me in. When I reached the water's edge, the surface was utterly still, reflecting the moon with perfect clarity. My reflection stared back at me, its expression blank. For a moment I thought maybe it was over, that it wouldn't come. And then my reflection moved. It stood up, stepping closer to the surface, its eyes locking onto mine. Slowly, its lips curled into that horrible smile, and it raised a hand, beckoning. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to breathe. The water rippled, and the thing began to rise. The thing emerged from the lake with impossible grace, water sliding off its form like oil, leaving it dry and unblemished. It was me every line, every detail but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Its movements were too smooth, its smile too wide, and its eyes were endless. Black pits, as if they'd been hollowed out and filled with nothingness. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my grip, the beam of light flickering over its face. Cocked its head at me, mimicking my fear with exaggerated curiosity. Then it took a step forward, the ground beneath its bare feet leaving no trace, no sound, as if it wasn't fully part of this world yet. My voice cracked as I shouted, "Stay back." It didn't stop. With trembling hands, I reached for the shard of broken mirror in my pocket, holding it out like a talisman. The reflection paused, its head tilting the other way now, as if it recognized the object. "Is this what you want?" I demanded, trying to mask the terror in my voice. The shard caught the moonlight, its jagged edge glittering. "Come any closer, and I'll destroy it." For a moment, the thing hesitated, its smile faltering. But then it started laughing, a dry, brittle sound like branches snapping in the wind. "You can't destroy me," it said, the words spilling from its mouth in my voice, but twisted, hollow. "I'm already part of you." The marks on my arm burned at its words, the pain searing now, forcing a gasp from my throat. The spiral seemed to move, writhing under my skin like it was alive. The reflection lunged. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight skittering away, and plunging the forest into darkness. All I could see was the moonlight glinting off the water, and the thing's eyes, gleaming like shards of obsidian as it loomed over me. It grabbed my arm, its fingers icy and impossibly strong. Pain erupted from the marks, and I screamed, kicking and thrashing as it dragged me toward the lake. "Trade places," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "It's your turn to drown." I felt the water lap at my heels, cold and clinging, and panic surged through me. I reached out, blindly, my hand closing around the shard of glass. With every ounce of strength I had left, I drove it into the reflection's arm. It screamed a sound that wasn't human, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring and my vision blur. Black, tar-like liquid spilled from the wound, hissing and steaming as it hit the ground. The reflection staggered back, its face contorted in rage, and for the first time it looked afraid. That was when I realized it could be hurt. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the shard like a lifeline. The reflection stood at the edge of the lake, its form flickering now, its edges blurring like a corrupted image. But its eyes, those void-like eyes, were locked on mine, seething with hatred. "You can't escape me," it snarled, its voice echoing like a chorus of whispers. "This is only the beginning." The lake rippled violently, as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. The reflection raised a hand, and the water began to surge upward, a dark wave reaching for me. I didn't think I acted. I threw the shard of glass with all my strength. The moment it hit the water, the wave froze mid-surge, shattering into a spray of fine mist. Reflection let out another unearthly scream, its form twisting and writhing as cracks spider-webbed across its body. The black liquid poured from it now, pooling at its feet and sinking into the soil. It clawed at the air, trying to reach me one last time, but its form dissolved, collapsing into a puddle of inky water that seeped back into the lake. And then, everything went still. The silence was deafening, broken only by my ragged breathing. The lake's surface had returned to its eerie calm, reflecting the moon as if nothing had happened. I sank to my knees, my entire body trembling, the marks on my arm still burning faintly. The spiral was fading now, the lines unraveling like smoke, but I knew it wasn't over. The lake had let me go, but it wasn't finished with me. I glanced at the broken shard lying on the shore, the edges dulled now, as if the lake had sapped its power. My reflection stared back at me in the water, blank and lifeless, its movements delayed by a fraction of a second. I turned and walked away without looking back. When I got home, the house was eerily quiet. I checked every mirror, every reflective surface. But the thing didn't appear again. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was dread. Sarah called me the next morning. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice shaking. "For now," I said, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. It stared back at me, its expression empty, its eyes just a little too dark. "Be careful," Sarah said. "The lake doesn't forget." But the unease never left me. Every time I caught my reflection in a window or a puddle, I held my breath, waiting for it to move on its own. I avoided mirrors as much as possible, but I couldn't avoid them forever. And then, one night, as I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection out of the corner of my eye. It was smiling. I stared at the mirror, my chest tightening as my reflection's grin widened, stretching unnaturally across its face. My legs locked in place, and for a moment, I thought it was happening all over. Again the lake, the shadow, the cold grip of its hand. But the reflection didn't move. It stood there, smiling, perfectly still. I stepped back slowly, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was so wound up that I was seeing things. But as I turned to leave the hallway, I heard a knock. It didn't come from the front door or the windows, but from the mirror itself. A sharp, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I turned back, my skin prickling with cold sweat. The reflection wasn't smiling anymore. It was pressing its palm against the glass, its face blank, its eyes as dark as the lake. Another knock, this time louder. The air in the room shifted, growing dense and heavy, and I could swear I felt the faintest vibration beneath my feet. I stumbled back into the living room, grabbing my phone to call Sarah, but the screen was dead, just a black reflection staring back at me. And then I heard it again. Not the knocking this time, but the whispering. It started softly, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But as I strained to listen, the words became clear, weaving through the stillness of the house. "You belong to us now." The voice wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was all around me, seeping into the walls, the floor, the air itself. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch, crawling toward me with impossible slowness. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real. You're not real." The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, deafening bang that shook the entire house. The mirror in the hallway cracked, a jagged line splintering across its surface. And then, the reflection stepped out. It didn't happen in a burst of shattered glass or a dramatic gust of wind. One moment, it was in the mirror, and the next it was standing in front of me, perfectly whole, its eyes hollow and unblinking. "It's your turn," it said, its voice an exact match for mine. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. The thing moved. Closer, its footsteps eerily soundless. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It crouched down, its face inches from mine, and tilted its head in that same mocking way. "You've already opened the door," it whispered. "You can't close it now." Before I could react, it grabbed my arm, and the pain exploded again, worse than before. The spiral marks flared to life, glowing faintly as they coiled tighter, wrapping around my skin like chains. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. When I opened them, I was standing at the edge of the lake. The water was still. The moon reflected perfectly in its surface, but something was different. Looked down and saw my reflection staring back at me, its eyes wide with terror. It pounded on the glassy surface of the water as though it were trapped behind it. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that it wasn't my reflection at all. It was me. I reached out instinctively, but the reflection's movements didn't match mine. It screamed, silently, its mouth moving in desperate pleas I couldn't hear. And then, behind it, the lake began to ripple. The shadowy forms the ones Sarah had mentioned rose up from the depths, their twisted, distorted faces smiling as they dragged the reflection down. I stumbled back from the water's edge, clutching my head as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent now. You belong here. I looked down at my hands, at the marks that now glowed faintly under my skin, and realized the truth. I hadn't escaped the lake. I never had. I was still part of it. I don't know how long it's been since that night, days, weeks, maybe months. Time doesn't feel real anymore. I try to tell myself I'm free, that I won, but deep down I know better. Sometimes when I pass a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something moving behind me, something dark and twisted, its smile stretching too wide. And sometimes just for a moment, I see myself on the other side, pounding on the glass, begging to be let out. And then I remember the words Sarah said to me before I left her house. The lake doesn't forget. She was right. It doesn't. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? Drop your creepiest stories in the comments.